In the summer of 1914, Canada was a nation of barely 8 million people, a dominion within the British Empire that had never fought a major war on foreign soil. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, Canada found itself automatically at war as well. Within weeks, volunteers flooded recruiting stations across the country. Farmers from Saskatchewan, lumberjacks from British Columbia, factory workers from Ontario, fishermen from the Maritimes. They came seeking adventure, driven by duty, or simply following friends and brothers into the unknown. Few could have imagined the horror that awaited them in the mud and wire of Flanders and France, or that they would forge a reputation as among the most feared and effective soldiers of the entire war. The first Canadian contingent sailed from Quebec in October 1914, over 30,000 men crammed into a convoy of transport ships bound for England. They were poorly equipped, hastily trained, and led largely by British officers who regarded colonials with thinly veiled condescension. Their uniforms were a patchwork of Canadian and British issue. Their Ross rifles, a source of national pride, would prove dangerously unreliable in the filth of trench warfare. Yet these men, drawn from the vast expanses of a young country, brought with them qualities that would prove invaluable: self-reliance, marksmanship honed by hunting in the wilderness, and a certain disregard for the rigid class distinctions that paralysed much of the British Army. They would need every advantage they possessed, for the Western Front was evolving into a slaughterhouse unlike anything in human history. The journey across the Atlantic took nearly 2 weeks, with men packed below decks in conditions that would have been condemned for transporting livestock. Seasickness was universal, and the stench of vomit, unwashed bodies, and poor ventilation created a misery that many veterans would later recall as worse than some of their experiences in the trenches. Private Arthur Mackenzie from Winnipeg spent most of the voyage huddled in his hammock, unable to keep down the ship's rations, wondering what insanity had possessed him to volunteer. When the convoy finally reached Plymouth, the men stumbled onto British soil, weak, disoriented, and thoroughly miserable. They were immediately marched to Salisbury Plain, where they would spend a cold, wet winter training in conditions that turned the camp into a quagmire of mud that reached to their knees. Salisbury Plain, in the winter of 1914-15, was a proving ground that tested Canadian resolve before a single shot was fired in anger. The weather was relentlessly wet, and proper facilities were lacking. Tents collapsed under the weight of accumulated rain, and men slept in pools of water. The Ross rifle, designed for the clean conditions of target shooting, began to show its fatal flaws. The bolt action would jam when exposed to mud, rendering the weapon useless at the moment it was most needed. Canadian officers complained, but were told by British superiors that colonial troops simply didn't know how to maintain their weapons properly. This condescension would persist until Canadians proved themselves in battle, and even then, some British officers never fully shed their prejudices. Training at Salisbury Plain was rudimentary by later standards, focused on parade ground drill and outdated tactics that had little relevance to the static warfare evolving in France and Belgium. Officers lectured about flanking movements and cavalry charges, concepts that would prove suicidal in the face of modern artillery and machine guns. The men practiced bayonet drill, learning to thrust and parry against straw-filled dummies, while instructors shouted about the importance of cold steel and British pluck. What they were not taught was how to survive in waterlogged trenches under constant shell fire, how to deal with gas attacks, or how to cross no man's land under machine gun fire. These lessons would have to be learned in the most brutal classroom imaginable, at a cost measured in thousands of lives. By February 1915, the 1st Canadian Division was judged ready, or at least ready enough, to take its place in the line. They crossed the English Channel and marched to the Ypres salient, a bulge in the Allied line that jutted into German-held territory. The town of Ypres itself was already a ruin, its medieval cloth hall and cathedral shattered by German artillery. The surrounding countryside had been transformed from peaceful Flemish farmland into a moonscape of shell craters, shattered trees and mud. Corporal James Sullivan from Halifax got his first look at the frontline trenches and felt his stomach turn. The trenches were shallow ditches, half filled with freezing water, reinforced with sandbags that were rotting and collapsing. Duckboards provided uncertain footing above the mud, and the stench of death hung in the air. Bodies from earlier fighting had been hastily buried in the trench walls themselves, and the constant shelling exposed them again. The daily routine of trench life was a grinding monotony punctuated by moments of terror. Stand-to came before dawn, with every man manning the fire step in case of a German attack in the uncertain light. After dawn passed without incident, half the men would be allowed to rest while the others maintained watch, repaired damage from the previous night's shelling, and tried to keep the trenches from collapsing entirely. Rats were everywhere, grown fat on corpses, fearless and aggressive. They would crawl over sleeping men and eat any food left unguarded. Private Thomas Brennan from Toronto developed a visceral hatred for the creatures, spending his off-duty hours hunting them with a club, but for every rat killed, 10 more appeared. Lice were equally ubiquitous, infesting every uniform and causing constant itching and skin infections. Men would spend hours running candle flames along the seams of their uniforms, hearing the lice pop in the heat, knowing it was a futile gesture that would provide relief for only a few hours. The Germans held the higher ground around the Ypres salient, which gave them observation over much of the British and Canadian positions. Their artillery could strike any target with devastating accuracy, and there was no warning before shells would begin falling. Men learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound: the crack of field guns, the howl of heavy shells, the distinctive whine of the Minenwerfers, the German trench mortars that lobbed massive projectiles in a high arc. The heavy shells were the worst, capable of obliterating entire sections of trench and everyone in them. Corporal William Fraser from Vancouver watched a direct hit land on a traverse 20 yards from his position, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No men, no equipment, just a crater where moments before 6 soldiers had been crouching. The survivors were expected to continue their duties as if nothing had happened, though Fraser found his hands shaking uncontrollably for hours afterward. Snipers were another constant threat. The Germans had developed specialized sniper units equipped with scoped rifles and camouflaged positions, and they watched the Canadian trenches constantly for any careless movement, standing too high above the parapet, exposing yourself for too long at a firing loophole, or moving during daylight where you could be observed. All were potentially fatal mistakes. Lieutenant Charles Morrison of the 3rd Battalion learned this lesson when a private in his platoon, a young man named David Peterson from Saskatchewan, raised his head above the parapet for just a moment to get his bearings. The shot came instantly, and Peterson dropped without a sound, killed by a bullet through the forehead. Morrison had the grim duty of writing to Peterson's parents, trying to find words that would provide some comfort while honestly describing how their son had died. He failed, as every officer who wrote such letters failed, because there were no words adequate to the task. On the afternoon of April 22, 1915, soldiers in the Canadian trenches noticed something unusual. A yellowish-green cloud was drifting across no man's land from the German positions, hugging the ground and moving with the prevailing wind toward the French colonial troops holding the line to the Canadian left. At first, some men thought it was smoke meant to conceal an attack, but those who had seen gas used in mining accidents recognized it for what it was: poison. Within minutes, French African troops began streaming back in panic, coughing and choking, many collapsing as their lungs filled with fluid. The cloud was chlorine gas, released from thousands of cylinders the Germans had positioned in their forward trenches. It was the first large-scale use of chemical weapons on the Western Front, and it caught the Allies completely unprepared. The gas cloud rolled over the Canadian positions at Saint-Julien and Kitchener's Wood, and men suddenly found themselves fighting for breath. Chlorine reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, effectively burning the victim from the inside. Private Robert Anderson from Calgary felt his throat and chest burning, his eyes streaming with tears that made it impossible to see. Men tore off their uniforms, trying to relieve the sensation, clawing at their own throats in agony. The only protection available was crude. Soldiers were told to urinate on a cloth and hold it over their nose and mouth, as the ammonia in urine would partially neutralize the chlorine. It was a desperate measure that provided minimal protection, but it was all they had. Anderson pressed his urine-soaked handkerchief to his face and tried to maintain his position as German infantry advanced behind the gas cloud. The German attack following the gas release should have broken through the Allied line completely. A 4-mile gap had been opened by the flight of the French colonial troops, and only scattered Canadian units stood between the Germans and a clean breakthrough to the Channel ports. But the Canadians did not run, despite the gas, despite casualties mounting by the minute, despite having no idea what reserves might be available to support them. They held their positions and poured rifle fire into the advancing Germans. The Ross rifle, that source of so much complaint during training, began to fail under combat conditions exactly as veterans had warned. The bolts would jam after a few rounds, forcing soldiers to kick them open or abandon the weapon entirely and pick up a rifle from a dead man. Sergeant Michael O'Donnell of the 15th Battalion found himself commanding what remained of his platoon, 8 men out of 30, in a section of trench that was under attack from 3 sides. The German infantry, wearing primitive gas masks that made them look like monsters, came forward in waves. O'Donnell's men fired until their rifles jammed, then fixed bayonets and prepared for close combat. When the Germans reached the trench, the fighting became savage and primitive. Men fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, rifle butts, and bare hands. O'Donnell killed 2 German soldiers with his bayonet, the training ground drill translating into brutal reality, before a German officer shot him in the shoulder with a pistol. One of his men, Private Henry Walsh from Montreal, dragged him to cover and managed to get a field dressing on the wound, even as fighting raged around them. The Battle of Second Ypres continued for 3 days, with the Canadians conducting desperate counterattacks to restore the line and prevent a German breakthrough. On the night of April 22nd, the 10th Battalion and 16th Battalion launched an attack toward Kitchener's Wood to recapture high ground that overlooked Canadian positions. They advanced in the darkness across open ground swept by German machine gun fire, with no artillery support and minimal knowledge of enemy positions. It was a calculated sacrifice, and the casualties were appalling. Private James McLeod from Nova Scotia made it halfway to the German positions before a machine gun burst cut him down. He lay in a shell crater until dawn, unable to move because of a shattered leg, listening to the cries of other wounded men who would not survive the night. When stretcher bearers finally reached him the next day, he had lost so much blood that he would never fully recover. By April 25th, when the battle finally subsided, the 1st Canadian Division had suffered over 6,000 casualties, killed, wounded, gassed or missing. Some units had been virtually destroyed. The 10th Battalion had lost over 70% of its strength in the attack on Kitchener's Wood. Bodies lay thick in no man's land, many of them unrecoverable because the Germans maintained continuous fire over the area. But the line had held. The Germans had failed to achieve the breakthrough they sought, and the Canadian Division had established a reputation for stubborn, defensive fighting that would persist throughout the war. British commanders, who had doubted whether colonial troops would stand firm in a crisis, began to revise their estimates. The Canadians had proven they would not break, even under conditions that had routed more experienced French units. The aftermath of Second Ypres brought changes, though not quickly enough to save additional lives. The Ross rifle was increasingly abandoned by frontline troops, who picked up Lee Enfield rifles from British casualties whenever possible. This practice was officially forbidden, but officers looked the other way because they understood that their men's lives depended on having reliable weapons. Gas masks began to be issued, first crude flannel hoods soaked in chemicals, later more sophisticated respirators with replaceable filters. Training incorporated lessons from the gas attack, with men drilled on how to don their masks quickly when gas alarms sounded, but the trauma of the attack lingered. Men who had inhaled chlorine suffered from damaged lungs for the rest of their lives, and many developed psychological reactions to even harmless smoke that recalled that terrible afternoon. The expansion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force continued throughout 1915 and into 1916. A 2nd Canadian Division was formed, then a 3rd and 4th, until by 1916 the Canadian Corps comprised 4 full divisions of nearly 100,000 men. This made it one of the largest corps-sized formations in the British Army and gave Canada an unprecedented degree of military influence. With size came the opportunity for Canadian officers to assume higher command positions. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, who had been a real estate agent and militia officer in Victoria before the war, emerged as one of the most capable commanders in the Canadian Corps. He was not a charismatic leader in the traditional sense. He was heavy-set, often pessimistic, and had a reputation as a warrior who obsessed over details. But he understood modern warfare better than most of his contemporaries, and he fought stubbornly to ensure that Canadian lives were not wasted in futile attacks. The summer of 1916 brought the Somme offensive, the British Empire's major effort to break the German line in France. It began on July 1st with the worst day in British military history, nearly 60,000 casualties for minimal gains. The Canadian Corps was not involved in the initial attack, but by September they were committed to the ongoing offensive as part of efforts to capture the village of Courcelette. The battlefield they encountered was unlike anything seen at Ypres. Months of bombardment had churned the earth into a wilderness of overlapping shell craters with no recognizable landscape features remaining. Trees had been reduced to splintered stumps, villages to piles of rubble, and the ground was seeded with unexploded shells and the bodies of men from earlier attacks that had never been recovered. Private George Henderson from Saskatoon arrived at the Somme in mid-September and was immediately struck by the scale of industrialized warfare. The British artillery bombardment that preceded Canadian attacks involved hundreds of guns firing continuously, creating a roar that could be heard dozens of miles away. The ground shook constantly from the impact of shells, and even in reserve positions miles behind the front, conversation was nearly impossible over the noise. At night, the horizon glowed red from muzzle flashes and exploding shells, turning the darkness into a hellish twilight. Henderson tried to write a letter home to his wife, attempting to describe what he was experiencing, but found himself unable to capture it in words. How could you explain to someone in peaceful Saskatchewan what it meant to live in a landscape where violent death was a constant presence? The attack on Courcelette was scheduled for September 15, 1916, and would be the Canadian Corps' first experience with tanks, the new British secret weapon. These early tanks were slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery fire, but they could cross trenches and barbed wire that would stop infantry dead. The plan called for the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions to attack behind a creeping barrage, with tanks supporting the assault. On paper, it looked like a solution to the problem of trench warfare. In reality, it was another brutal exercise in sending men forward into machine gun fire, with success measured in yards gained at the cost of hundreds of casualties. Corporal Edward Burke of the 22nd Battalion, the Van Duce, went over the top at 0 hour with his section following close behind the creeping barrage. The artillery fire was supposed to advance at a rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes, forcing the infantry to keep pace or risk being left behind in range of German defensive fire. Burke and his men moved through a landscape that had been transformed into an alien nightmare. Shell craters overlapped, filled with water, and the bodies of men killed in earlier attacks. German barbed wire, supposedly cut by the bombardment, remained intact in places, forcing units to bunch up at gaps where machine gun fire was inevitably concentrated. Burke saw one of the tanks advancing on their left, its appearance generating excited shouts from the men around him, but within minutes it had been hit by German artillery and sat burning, smoke pouring from its hatches. The fighting for Courcelette village itself was savage, house-to-house combat through rubble that barely resembled buildings. German defenders had fortified cellars and strongpoints, and each had to be cleared individually with grenades and close-range rifle fire. Private André Lavoie from Quebec City was part of a bombing team tasked with clearing German positions. The technique was crude but effective. One man would throw a grenade into a cellar or bunker, and the team would rush in immediately after it exploded to kill or capture any survivors. Lavoie participated in clearing 7 positions before a German soldier, wounded and playing dead, shot him in the stomach at point-blank range. His section mates killed the German and got Lavoie to a dressing station, but he died before he could be evacuated further to the rear. The Canadian Corps captured Courcelette and held it against German counterattacks, but the cost was terrible. Over 24,000 Canadian casualties were suffered during the various Somme operations between September and November 1916. Units that had gone into the line at full strength emerged as shadows of themselves. The 22nd Battalion lost over 400 men. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, a unit with particular pride in its professional standards, suffered similar casualties. Veteran soldiers who had survived Ypres found themselves among the last of the originals, surrounded by reinforcements fresh from Canada who had never experienced combat. These new men had to learn the same lessons that the originals had learned in 1915, and many did not survive the education. The winter of 1916-17 provided a respite from major operations, but not from the daily attrition of trench warfare. Men died from artillery fire, sniper bullets, trench raids, disease, and accidents in roughly equal measure. Trench foot became epidemic in some units, the result of standing for days in waterlogged trenches that turned feet into swollen, infected masses that could lead to gangrene and amputation. Officers conducted daily foot inspections, forcing men to remove their boots and rub their feet with whale oil, but this was only partially effective. Private Samuel Richardson from Alberta had to be evacuated with trench foot so severe that he lost 3 toes, ending his service at the front. He considered himself lucky. At least he would survive the war. During this winter period, the Canadian Corps underwent intensive preparation for an operation that would become its defining moment, the assault on Vimy Ridge. This 7-mile escarpment dominated the Douai Plain and had resisted French attempts to capture it in 1914 and 1915 at a cost of over 150,000 casualties. The ridge was honeycombed with German tunnels, bunkers and defensive positions and was considered by many to be impregnable. But Lieutenant General Arthur Currie and the Canadian Corps staff were determined that this time would be different. They would apply every lesson learned from 2 years of costly failures, and they would assault the ridge with a thoroughness of preparation unprecedented in British military operations. The preparation for Vimy began months before the actual assault. Canadian tunnelling companies recruited from miners and engineers dug extensive tunnel systems that would allow troops to move forward to jumping off positions without being observed or shelled. Subways several miles long were excavated, complete with electric lighting, water pipes and communication cables. These tunnels would prove crucial in allowing the concentration of forces without tipping off German intelligence. Meanwhile, above ground, elaborate trench systems were constructed that brought the Canadian front line closer to German positions. Working parties laboured every night under constant German harassing fire, digging new trenches and stringing barbed wire, knowing that some of them would not return to safety before dawn. Artillery preparation was central to Currie's plan. He insisted on counter-battery work, identifying and destroying German artillery positions before the infantry attack, and allocated significant resources to this task. Aerial photography was used extensively, with Royal Flying Corps reconnaissance aircraft photographing German positions daily to track changes in defences. Forward observation officers worked in close contact with infantry commanders to ensure that artillery support would be available where and when it was needed. The plan called for a creeping barrage of unprecedented sophistication, with shells falling just ahead of the advancing infantry and lifting by precise increments as the attack progressed. Infantry officers were given detailed timetables showing exactly where the barrage would be at any given minute, allowing them to keep their men in close contact with the protective curtain of steel. Every soldier in the assault divisions received extensive briefing on his specific objectives. Large-scale models of the terrain were constructed behind the lines, showing every trench, bunker and strongpoint on the ridge. Men walked through these models repeatedly until they knew their objectives by memory. Each platoon was given maps and aerial photographs showing their sector. This was revolutionary. Previously, only officers had access to maps, on the assumption that ordinary soldiers couldn't understand them or didn't need them. The Canadian approach recognized that small unit leaders would need to make independent decisions once the attack began and chaos descended, and they could only do so if they understood the larger picture. Sergeant William Thompson of the 1st Canadian Division's 4th Battalion later recalled spending hours studying the model terrain, memorizing landmarks and approaches until he could navigate his section's route with his eyes closed. The assault was scheduled for Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917. In the days leading up to the attack, Canadian troops moved forward through the tunnel systems to their jumping-off positions. The underground passages were crowded and claustrophobic, lit by electric bulbs that cast harsh shadows on the walls. Men sat in alcoves carved into the tunnel sides, checking their equipment, writing what might be their last letters home, or simply waiting in silence with their own thoughts. Private Jack Morrison from New Brunswick tried to sleep in the hours before the attack, but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined what awaited above ground: German machine guns, artillery fire, barbed wire. He had survived the Somme, but he knew that survival was largely a matter of luck, and luck eventually ran out for everyone. 0 hour was set for 5:30 a.m, timed to allow the assault to begin in the half-light of dawn, giving attackers some concealment but enough light to see objectives. The morning broke cold and wet, with sleet driving into the faces of the waiting Canadians. At exactly 5:30, over 1,000 Canadian and British guns opened fire simultaneously, and all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps went over the top together for the first time in their history. The barrage was overwhelming, a storm of high explosive and shrapnel that obliterated German forward positions. Corporal Robert Harrison of the 3rd Brigade climbed out of the trench into a maelstrom of noise and confusion. The creeping barrage was falling just ahead, close enough that he could feel the blast waves from exploding shells. Following doctrine, he kept his section moving just behind the barrage, so close that fragments occasionally fell among them, but close enough that German defenders would have no time to man their positions before Canadians were upon them. The initial assault went well for the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Canadian divisions. German defenders, stunned by the bombardment and blinded by sleet and smoke, emerged from their dugouts to find Canadians already in their trenches. The weeks of rehearsal paid off as small units moved with purpose toward their objectives, using fire and movement tactics to suppress strong points while other elements advanced. Private Thomas Caldwell from Ontario experienced his first real combat at Vimy and was surprised to find that the training had prepared him better than he expected. When his section encountered a German machine gun position, they responded automatically. One group provided covering fire, while another worked around the flank, and grenades dealt with the gun crew. It was almost mechanical, and only later did Caldwell realize that he had killed at least 2 men, a thought that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The 4th Canadian Division, tasked with capturing the highest point on the ridge, Hill 145, faced the most difficult fighting. German defences here were strongest, and the preliminary bombardment had been less effective in destroying bunkers and trenches. Lieutenant Philip Green of the 87th Battalion led his platoon forward into withering machine gun fire from multiple positions that had survived the barrage. Men began falling around him, some killed instantly, others crying out in pain from wounds. Green felt a bullet tug at his sleeve, missing his arm by inches, and forced himself to keep moving forward. If he stopped, if he went to ground, his men would follow suit, and the attack would stall under German fire. The platoon fought forward yard by yard, taking cover in shell craters, throwing grenades at German positions, firing at any target that presented itself. The fighting for Hill 145 continued throughout the day and into the night, a confused melee of small unit actions in trenches and shell craters. Sergeant Frank Morrison found himself in command of survivors from 3 different platoons after all the officers in his area had been killed or wounded. He organized a defense against a German counterattack, placing men in covered positions and ensuring that their fields of fire overlapped. When the Germans came forward through the darkness, Morrison's improvised force stopped them with rifle and machine gun fire at close range. The fighting was savage and confused, with both sides throwing grenades at shadows and firing at muzzle flashes. Morrison survived the night, but 2/3 of the men under his command did not. By April 12th, the entire ridge was in Canadian hands. The operation had captured more ground, more prisoners, and more artillery pieces than any previous British offensive on the Western Front. 4 divisions attacking together, with careful preparation and overwhelming artillery support, had achieved what others had declared impossible. But the cost had been significant. Over 10,000 Canadian casualties, including more than 3,000 dead. Every yard of the ridge had been purchased with blood, and the hospitals behind the lines were overwhelmed with wounded. Chaplain William Ferguson moved among the casualties, offering what comfort he could, but found himself overwhelmed by the scale of suffering. Men with terrible wounds, missing limbs, faces destroyed by shrapnel, abdominal injuries that meant slow, agonizing death, needed more than prayers, but prayers were often all he had to give. Vimy Ridge became a defining moment in Canadian national consciousness, the battle where the 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time and achieved a victory that had eluded others. The memorial, built on the ridge after the war, a massive structure of white stone bearing the names of 11,000 Canadians who died in France with no known grave, became a place of pilgrimage. But for the men who fought there, Vimy was another battle in a war that seemed endless, another week of horror that killed friends and brothers, another memory that would wake them screaming decades later. Private Henry Walsh, who had survived 2nd Ypres and dragged his wounded sergeant to safety, was killed by a German sniper at Vimy on April 10th, shot through the head while moving between positions. He was 23 years old, and his body was never recovered, becoming one of the names on the memorial. The summer of 1917 brought no respite for the Canadian Corps. After a brief period of rest and reinforcement, they were given another objective that others had failed to capture: Hill 70, north of the French city of Lens. This time, Lieutenant General Currie insisted on selecting the objective himself rather than simply following British orders. When told to capture Lens itself, he argued that Hill 70 was the key terrain and that holding the hill would make Lens untenable for the Germans. His British superiors reluctantly agreed, setting a precedent for Canadian operational independence that would grow throughout the war. The assault on Hill 70 was scheduled for August 15, 1917, and followed the same pattern of meticulous preparation that had characterized Vimy. Artillery plans were even more sophisticated, with counter-battery fire, suppression of German positions, and protective barrages all carefully coordinated. Currie predicted that the Germans would counterattack heavily to retake the hill, which dominated their positions around Lens, and he prepared accordingly. The initial assault would be supported by massive artillery fire, but the real test would come in the hours and days after, when German forces would attempt to drive the Canadians off the hill. Currie's staff prepared detailed defensive plans, with artillery targets pre-registered on likely German assembly areas and approach routes. The assault began at 4:25 a.m. with a hurricane bombardment that turned the German front line into a cauldron of fire and smoke. Private David Henderson of the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles went forward with his battalion through what had been the outskirts of Lens, now reduced to rubble. The advance was opposed by German defenders who had survived the bombardment in deep bunkers, and the fighting quickly became a close-quarters battle through ruins, where visibility was measured in yards. Henderson found himself separated from his section in the smoke and confusion, working his way through shattered buildings with 2 other soldiers he didn't know. They encountered a German machine gun position in a cellar and dealt with it using grenades, then pushed on toward their objective, the crest of Hill 70. The initial objectives were captured by mid-morning, with Canadian forces occupying a new line along the crest of the hill. Then, exactly as Currie had predicted, the German counterattacks began. Throughout the afternoon and evening of August 15th, German infantry attacked the Canadian positions repeatedly, supported by artillery fire and gas shells. Each attack was met by devastating Canadian defensive fire, with artillery observers on the hill itself directing guns onto German assembly areas and approach routes. Lieutenant Robert Fraser of the 8th Battalion spent 12 hours directing artillery fire from an observation post on the hilltop, calling down shells on German formations as they prepared to attack, adjusting fire onto groups that penetrated close to Canadian lines. By nightfall, he had lost count of the number of attacks he had helped repulse, and his voice was hoarse from shouting fire missions into the telephone. The battle for Hill 70 continued for 3 days, with the Germans launching 21 separate counterattacks in a desperate attempt to retake the high ground. Each was broken by artillery fire and determined Canadian defensive fighting. The Germans employed flamethrowers, gas, and fresh divisions brought up from reserve, but could not dislodge the Canadians. Lance Corporal William Clark of the 87th Battalion fought for 36 hours straight, his position attacked 7 times. His rifle barrel became so hot from continuous firing that he had to pour water on it between attacks to prevent it from warping. He survived the battle but collapsed from exhaustion and gas poisoning and had to be evacuated. He returned to his unit 6 weeks later to find that most of the men he had fought beside at Hill 70 were dead, killed in subsequent operations. The cost of Hill 70 was over 9,000 Canadian casualties, but the Germans had suffered far more. Estimates ranged from 20,000 to 25,000 casualties in their futile counterattacks. The Canadians had proven they could not only capture objectives, but hold them against the most determined opposition. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of Canadian artillery doctrine, with responsive, accurate fire controlled by forward observers proving devastating against massed German infantry. But once again, victory had been purchased with blood. Hospital trains carried thousands of wounded back to base hospitals and eventually to England, while burial parties worked to inter the dead before the summer heat turned corpses into unbearable health hazards. The autumn of 1917 brought the Canadian Corps to the Ypres salient once more, this time for an operation that would test them to their absolute limits, the assault on Passchendaele. The British Third Battle of Ypres had been grinding on since July through unprecedented rainfall that had transformed the battlefield into a swamp. Soldiers and pack animals drowned in shell holes filled with liquid mud. Wounded men who slipped off the narrow duckboard tracks that provided the only routes forward often sank beneath the surface and were never seen again. By October, when the offensive had stalled completely before the village of Passchendaele sitting atop a low ridge, British Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig turned to the Canadian Corps to finish what others could not. Lieutenant General Currie travelled to the salient to inspect the battlefield and was appalled by what he found. The elaborate trench systems that had characterised other sectors of the Western Front were impossible here. There were only shell holes linked by shallow ditches filled with water. Moving supplies forward required carrying everything over duckboard tracks through constant German artillery fire. There was no cover, no dry ground, and no possibility of manoeuvre. Currie protested to Haig, predicting that capturing Passchendaele would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties for a tactically worthless objective. He was overruled, and the Canadian Corps moved north to Flanders, its soldiers grim with the knowledge that they were being sent into a nightmare. Sergeant Frank Morrison of the 78th Battalion arrived in the Passchendaele sector in late October and could hardly believe conditions were this bad even after everything he had experienced. The duckboard tracks that led forward were under constant German artillery fire, and bodies of men killed in earlier attempts lay everywhere, beyond anyone's power to recover or bury. The mud was like thick porridge, making every movement exhausting. Morrison's battalion relieved a British unit that had been shattered in previous attacks, and the survivors looked like walking dead. Hollow-eyed, filthy, many suffering from exposure and trench fever. The British soldiers offered advice on German artillery patterns and machine gun positions, but their primary message was simple. This place was hell, and survival was a matter of luck. The first Canadian assault was scheduled for October 26th, a limited attack designed to capture preliminary objectives before the main push toward Passchendaele village itself. Private George Reynolds of the 46th Battalion participated in this attack, advancing through waist-deep mud toward German pillboxes that had survived months of bombardment. The German defenders had the advantage of concrete shelters and dry firing positions, while the attacking Canadians struggled through mud that made rapid movement impossible. Reynolds's platoon came under machine gun fire from a pillbox they hadn't known existed, concealed in the ruins of a building. Men began falling, and Reynolds saw his friend, Private Albert King from Montreal, hit in the chest by a burst that nearly cut him in half. King fell into a shell crater filled with water, and Reynolds tried to reach him, but he sank beneath the surface before help could arrive. The body was never recovered. The assault on Passchendaele required 4 separate attacks over 2 weeks, each one a costly effort to advance a few hundred yards through mud and German defensive fire. October 26th, October 30th, November 6th, and November 10th, each date marked another wave of Canadians going forward into conditions that seemed designed to break human endurance. Between attacks, men huddled in shell holes that provided minimal shelter from German artillery fire and the constant rain. There was no possibility of cooking hot food or drying clothes, and many soldiers developed pneumonia or trench fever from prolonged exposure. Private James Douglas from British Columbia spent 4 days in a forward position, surviving on cold rations and water from shell holes that also contained decomposing bodies. He lost 30 pounds during the Passchendaele operation and never fully recovered his health. The village of Passchendaele finally fell to Canadian forces on November 6th, captured by the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions, in an attack that involved fighting through ruins, where every cellar could contain a German machine gun. The fighting was house to house, or rather rubble pile to rubble pile, with grenades and close-range rifle fire. Corporal Martin Patterson of the 27th Battalion led a bombing team that cleared 7 German positions, working systematically through what remained of the village. In the last position, a German soldier detonated a grenade as Patterson's team entered, killing himself and 2 Canadians. Patterson survived, but was severely wounded by shrapnel and spent 6 months in hospital. He returned to Canada in 1918, his war over, one of thousands whose wounds ensured they would never fight again. By the time the Canadian Corps was withdrawn from Passchendaele in mid-November, Curry's prediction had proven almost exactly accurate. The operation had cost over 15,000 Canadian casualties for a few square miles of worthless shell-torn ground that would be abandoned the following year. There was no glory here, no triumphant success to celebrate. Men who survived Passchendaele were marked by it for the rest of their lives. Chaplain Thomas Anderson, who had been with the Canadian Corps since 1915, wrote in his diary that Passchendaele represented the lowest point of the war, the moment when it seemed that no objective, however tactically worthless, would be spared the sacrifice of thousands of lives. Yet once again, the Canadians had accomplished their mission when others had failed. The tactical lessons learned about the importance of adequate preparation, fresh troops, and realistic objectives would prove valuable in the year ahead, but the cost had been horrific. The winter of 1917-18 was a period of recuperation and rebuilding for the Canadian Corps. Units that had been shattered at Passchendaele were brought back to strength with reinforcements from Canada, though by this point in the war the quality of replacements was declining as the pool of volunteers dried up. Canada would not introduce conscription until late 1917, and the first conscripted soldiers did not reach France until early 1918. The volunteers who had filled the ranks in 1914 and 1915, men who were physically fit, motivated, and often with prior military experience in the militia, were increasingly replaced by men who had been less enthusiastic about service. This created tensions within units between veterans who had survived multiple battles and newcomers who had yet to prove themselves. Training during the winter focused on preparing for mobile warfare, a recognition that the static trench systems of the past 3 years might finally be breaking down. Small unit tactics were emphasized, with platoons organized around balanced combinations of rifles, Lewis guns, rifle grenades, and trench mortars. Each platoon became a self-contained fighting unit, capable of dealing with most tactical problems without needing to refer decisions up the chain of command. Section commanders were given more autonomy to make decisions based on the situation they encountered. This represented a fundamental shift from the top-down, centralized command structure that had characterized early war operations, and it reflected lessons learned at great cost about the chaos and confusion of actual combat. The spring of 1918 brought crisis. Germany, reinforced by divisions transferred from the now-collapsed Eastern Front after Russia's surrender, launched massive offensives designed to win the war before American forces could arrive in strength. The German Spring Offensive, beginning on March 21st, smashed through British lines in several places and threatened to separate British forces from the French and drive toward the Channel ports. The Canadian Corps was held in reserve as a strategic asset, a formation that could be counted on to hold critical positions or counterattack when the situation was most desperate. Canadian units were rushed south to help stem the German advance and found themselves fighting desperate defensive battles very different from the set-piece assaults they had been conducting. Private William Patterson of the 4th Canadian Division found himself in a hastily prepared defensive position near Arras as German forces advanced. The situation was confused, with conflicting orders, units intermingled, and constant reports of German breakthroughs on the flanks. Patterson's company was ordered to hold a section of trench regardless of what happened on either side, and they did so for 2 days against repeated German attacks. Ammunition ran low, and they scavenged bullets and grenades from the dead. Food ran out entirely, and they survived on water and whatever was in their emergency rations. German artillery fire was constant, and casualties mounted steadily. When they were finally relieved and withdrawn, Patterson's company had lost half its strength, but they had held their position and prevented a German breakthrough at that critical point. By July 1918, the German offensives had shot their bolt, exhausting their reserves and failing to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The initiative passed to the Allies, and planning began for coordinated counter-offensives that would push German forces back and eventually break their army. The Canadian Corps, now recognized as one of the most effective formations in the British Army, was given a crucial role in the first of these offensives, an attack near the city of Amiens designed to punch through German lines and threaten their rail communications. The operation would be launched in conditions of strict secrecy, with the Canadian Corps moving into position at the last possible moment to avoid alerting German intelligence that an attack was imminent. The Battle of Amiens, launched on August 8, 1918, was unlike any previous Western Front offensive. Instead of days of preliminary bombardment that telegraphed the attack, the artillery opened fire only minutes before 0 hour, combining high explosive shells, gas and smoke to paralyze German defenders. Over 400 tanks of the British Tank Corps advanced alongside the infantry, these new models more reliable than the monsters that had appeared at the Somme in 1916. The Royal Air Force flew low-level attacks against German positions, strafing trenches and dropping small bombs on strong points. Everything that had been learned about combined arms warfare over 4 years was applied in one coordinated blow. Lieutenant Edward Parsons of the 2nd Canadian Division went forward that morning into a battle that felt completely different from anything he had experienced. Instead of grinding forward against determined resistance toward limited objectives, his platoon broke through German lines and kept advancing. German defenders, many of them recent conscripts or older reservists called back to service, showed little inclination to fight. Some positions resisted fiercely, but others surrendered quickly, and gaps appeared in the German line that could be exploited. By mid-morning, Parsons's company had advanced over 3 miles, an almost unthinkable distance by Western Front standards, and found themselves in open country beyond the old trench systems. The advance on August 8th reached depths of 8 miles in some sectors, and the Canadian and Australian Corps captured thousands of prisoners along with hundreds of guns. German General Ludendorff would later call it the Black Day of the German Army, the moment when he realized that Germany could no longer win the war, but success came at cost nonetheless. Private Harold Bennett of the 102nd Battalion was killed by machine gun fire from a German position that had been bypassed in the rapid advance. He died within sight of open country, having survived 3 years of trench warfare only to fall during the breakthrough he had dreamed of. His death, like tens of thousands of others, became a statistic in the victory reports, mourned by family and friends but contributing to the larger narrative of Allied success. The Canadian Corps led the Allied advance through what became known as the 100 Days Offensive, the final campaign that broke the German army and ended the war. They fought through a succession of fortified positions, the Drocourt-Quéant line, Canal du Nord, Cambrai, Valenciennes, each requiring careful preparation and combined arms operations. These were not the desperate, costly frontal assaults of 1916, but sophisticated operations that combined infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft and engineers in ways that the Germans could no longer effectively counter. Lieutenant General Currie's insistence on thorough preparation saved countless lives, even as it sometimes frustrated British commanders, who demanded faster advances regardless of cost. The crossing of the Canal du Nord in late September 1918 exemplified Canadian tactical sophistication at its peak. The canal was a major obstacle, with steep sides and limited crossing points, and German forces held strong positions on the far side. Currie's plan called for the 1st and 4th Canadian Divisions to cross on a narrow front where the canal was not fully flooded, then fan out once they had secured a bridgehead. The operation required precise timing and coordination, with infantry crossing on portable bridges erected by engineers under fire, while artillery provided suppressing fire against German positions. Sergeant William Thompson, now a veteran of 3 years fighting, led his platoon across a bridge that swayed under the weight of men and equipment. German shells falling around them, and somehow made it to the far side intact. The fighting through September and October 1918 was continuous, with the Canadian Corps averaging several miles of advance per week through German defensive positions that would have seemed impregnable earlier in the war. But the advance was not without cost. German machine gun nests positioned in ruins or concealed in shell holes could still inflict severe casualties on attacking units. Artillery fire remained deadly, and German rearguard actions fought with determination, even as the larger strategic situation became hopeless. Private Michael Sullivan of the 3rd Canadian Division was killed on October 15th, hit by a shell during an advance through open country near Cambrai. He had survived since 1915 through 2nd Ypres, the Somme, Vimy, Hill 70, and Passchendaele, only to die less than a month before the armistice. His death embodied the cruel randomness of war. Survival through years of horror did not guarantee making it to the end. The city of Mons, which held particular significance as the site of the first British engagement of the war in August 1914, became the Canadian Corps' final objective. By early November, German forces were in retreat across the entire Western Front, and armistice negotiations were underway. But the fighting continued, and men continued to die for objectives that would soon be rendered irrelevant by peace. Canadian forces entered Mons on November 10th, liberating the city amid celebrations from Belgian civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation. Private Samuel Martin of the 42nd Battalion marched through streets lined with cheering people offering food and drink, and found the contrast with the devastation he had grown accustomed to almost surreal. These were actual buildings still standing, civilians in relatively normal clothing, life continuing in something resembling normal fashion. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, with the armistice set to take effect at 11 a.m., Canadian forces were still advancing toward Mons. Private George Price of the 28th Battalion, a conscript from Nova Scotia who had been in France for less than a year, was killed by a German sniper at 10:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the guns fell silent. He was the last Canadian soldier killed in action during the First World War, though by no means the last to die from its effects. Price's death, so close to the end, seemed particularly tragic, but it was no different from the deaths of thousands of others who had fallen at random moments throughout 4 years of fighting. War did not make distinctions between those who died early and those who died late. The bullet or shell fragment was equally fatal, regardless of when it arrived. When the armistice took effect at 11 a.m., the guns along the Western Front fell silent for the first time in 4 years. The sudden quiet was disorienting for men who had lived with constant artillery fire for months or years. Some soldiers cheered, but many simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that they had survived. Private Thomas Brennan, who had been in France since early 1915 and had fought in every major Canadian engagement, found that he felt nothing but numbness. Too many friends were dead, too many horrors had been witnessed for there to be any simple emotion like joy or relief. He was alive, which seemed almost an accident given how many had died, but he would never be the same person who had volunteered in Toronto in 1914 with such naive enthusiasm. The final casualty figures for the Canadian Expeditionary Force were devastating. Of the 619,000 Canadians who served, over 66,000 were killed, and another 172,000 wounded, a casualty rate of nearly 40%. When disease, psychological casualties, and those who died of wounds after the armistice are included, the total cost was even higher. Some battalions suffered casualty rates exceeding 100%, meaning they had been entirely replaced at least once during the war. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, for example, had only 1 officer and 3 enlisted men serving at the armistice who had been with the unit when it arrived in France in 1914. Everyone else had been killed, wounded, or invalided out. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield casualties. Men returned home with physical wounds that would never fully heal, missing limbs, facial disfigurement, lungs damaged by gas, bodies wrecked by shrapnel and disease. Many more carried psychological wounds that were poorly understood at the time. Shell shock, as it was called, afflicted thousands of veterans who found themselves unable to cope with civilian life. Nightmares, sudden fits of rage, inability to hold employment, alcoholism, All were common among men who appeared physically unharmed, but had been broken by what they had experienced. Society at the time had little sympathy for such suffering, which was often seen as weakness or cowardice, and many veterans suffered in isolation rather than seeking help that was in any case rarely available. The broader impact on Canadian society was profound. Towns and villages across the country erected monuments to local men who would never return, and scarcely a family was untouched by loss. The war had transformed Canada from a dominion whose foreign policy was directed from London into a nation that had earned the right to speak with its own voice. Canadian representatives signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, and Canada joined the League of Nations as an independent member. The battles of 1915 to 1918 entered Canadian national mythology as foundational moments, particularly Vimy Ridge, which was treated as the moment Canada truly became independent in spirit, if not yet in law. But this national coming-of-age narrative, while containing truth, sometimes obscured the more complex realities of what the war had meant. The Canadian Corps' reputation for ferocity and effectiveness had been earned through a combination of factors that were not always comfortable to acknowledge. Yes, Canadian soldiers had proven brave, determined, and adaptable, but their success had also been achieved through a ruthless pragmatism that sometimes bordered on brutality. Trench raids conducted by Canadian units became notorious for their violence, with raiders armed with clubs, daggers, and sharpened entrenching tools rather than rifles, conducting night attacks designed to capture prisoners and kill German soldiers in their trenches. These were not honourable engagements governed by rules of war, but savage close-quarters combat where the objective was to terrorise the enemy. There were documented incidents of Canadian soldiers refusing to take prisoners during attacks, particularly after German forces had been found to have killed wounded Canadians or used false surrenders to lure soldiers into ambushes. This descent into a more brutal form of warfare was not unique to Canadians. All armies on the Western Front experienced it to some degree, but it contradicted the narrative of honourable soldiers fighting a just war. The reality was that trench warfare had reduced combat to a primitive, savage level where survival often depended on acting before the enemy could act, and where mercy could be seen as dangerous weakness. German soldiers learned to fear Canadian units specifically because of their reputation for aggressive raiding and unwillingness to take prisoners in certain circumstances. The tactical innovations developed by the Canadian Corps were real and significant. Their artillery doctrine, emphasizing counter-battery fire and responsive support for infantry, was among the most advanced in the British Army. The reorganization of infantry platoons into balanced teams capable of independent action anticipated developments that would become standard in later conflicts. The emphasis on detailed planning, rehearsal, and ensuring that every soldier understood the mission represented a departure from the rigid top-down command structures that had characterized early war operations. These innovations saved lives and made the Canadian Corps more effective than it would otherwise have been, but tactical sophistication alone does not explain the Canadian reputation. What truly set the Corps apart was its willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives, to keep attacking even when losses were severe, and to hold positions against counterattacks regardless of cost. This determination was partly a function of morale and unit cohesion. Soldiers fought for their comrades and to uphold unit reputation rather than for abstract concepts of patriotism. But it was also a function of command decisions that sometimes prioritized mission accomplishment over casualty minimization. Curry's careful planning saved lives compared to more reckless commanders, but he still ordered attacks knowing that thousands would die because the strategic situation demanded it. The physical and cultural background of Canadian soldiers contributed to their effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify but were widely recognized at the time. Many Canadians came from harsh environments, prairie winters, northern forests, frontier conditions that had made them self-reliant and physically hardy. The skills developed in civilian occupations often transferred directly to military applications. Hunters made good marksmen, miners understood working underground, farmers could manage horses and navigate cross-country. There was also a certain egalitarianism in Canadian society that produced soldiers less inhibited by class distinctions than their British counterparts. Officers who could not maintain their men's respect were more likely to face resistance or be quietly bypassed in the Canadian Corps than in British formations where social class provided automatic authority. The multicultural nature of Canadian society, while often overlooked in post-war narratives that emphasised British heritage, also played a role. Indigenous soldiers served in numbers disproportionate to their population, often serving as scouts and snipers where their tracking and marksmanship skills proved valuable. French-Canadian units like the 22nd Battalion fought with distinction despite facing prejudice both within Canada and initially within the British command structure. Recent immigrants from across Europe brought diverse skills and perspectives. This diversity sometimes created tensions. Relations between English and French Canadians were strained, and racism directed at Indigenous soldiers was common. But it also created units with varied capabilities that could be deployed according to their strengths. The tunnelling companies that supported major Canadian operations deserve particular mention as an example of specialised capability. These units, recruited primarily from miners in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, conducted underground warfare that was simultaneously claustrophobic and terrifying. They dug tunnels beneath German lines to place massive explosive charges, working in cramped conditions with the constant risk of tunnel collapse, underground flooding, or German countermining operations. The work required technical skill, physical endurance, and extraordinary courage. Sapper John MacDonald of the 1st Canadian Tunnelling Company spent weeks working underground, before Vimy Ridge, digging chambers for explosives while listening for sounds of German tunnellers doing the same. The fear of being buried alive or killed in an underground encounter with enemy miners was constant, but the work was essential to the success of major operations. The evolution of Canadian military medicine and the treatment of casualties represented another area of significant achievement. Canadian medical units developed efficient systems for treating and evacuating wounded soldiers from the front lines through a chain of medical facilities to base hospitals and eventually back to Britain or Canada. The survival rate for wounded soldiers improved dramatically over the course of the war as techniques improved and facilities expanded. Major surgical advances were made in treating traumatic injuries, particularly through the work of Canadian doctors like John McCrae, who served as a medical officer while also writing the famous poem In Flanders Fields. But even with medical advances, many wounds remained beyond treatment. Abdominal injuries were usually fatal. Severe burns from flamethrowers or burning tanks meant prolonged suffering before death, and head wounds often meant survival with permanent disability. The role of Canadian nurses, though often overlooked in military histories focused on combat operations, was crucial to maintaining the fighting strength of the Corps. Canadian nursing sisters served in casualty clearing stations near the front lines, in base hospitals behind the lines, and in hospital ships transporting wounded across the Channel. They worked brutal hours under terrible conditions, dealing with wounds that would have been unimaginable in civilian practice. Nursing sister Margaret Wilson served at a casualty clearing station near Passchendaele, and later wrote of treating men so caked in mud that their wounds could not be properly assessed until they had been cleaned. She witnessed amputations, deaths from gas poisoning, psychological breakdowns, and every variety of suffering war could inflict. Her work, and that of thousands of other Canadian nurses, received far less recognition than it deserved. The Canadian Corps' reputation extended beyond its combat effectiveness to encompass a certain disregard for military formality that both endeared it to soldiers and frustrated British commanders accustomed to rigid discipline. Canadian soldiers were less likely to salute officers in rear areas, more likely to question orders that seemed pointless, and generally less concerned with the spit and polish aspects of military life. This informality did not extend to combat operations, where discipline was crucial and usually maintained, but it reflected a more democratic ethos where authority had to be earned rather than simply assumed. British officers who tried to command Canadian units using the same methods that worked with British soldiers often found themselves frustrated by resistance or simply ignored. This attitude was partly a function of how the Canadian Expeditionary Force had been recruited. The initial volunteers of 1914 were citizen soldiers who had chosen to enlist rather than professional servicemen or conscripts. They accepted military necessity but did not fully internalize the mindset of professional soldiers who accepted authority without question. As the war continued and casualties mounted, this attitude was reinforced by the experience of combat, which taught that survival often depended on individual initiative and the trust of close comrades rather than blind obedience to distant authority. Veterans learned to distinguish between orders that made tactical sense and orders issued by officers who did not understand frontline realities, and they responded accordingly. The introduction of conscription in 1917, which became necessary as volunteer numbers dwindled, created tensions within the Canadian Expeditionary Force and Canadian society more broadly. French-speaking Quebec opposed conscription strongly, seeing it as an English-Canadian attempt to force Quebecers to fight in a British war. Riots in Quebec City in 1918 left several dead and exposed deep divisions within Canadian society. The conscripts who eventually reached France in 1918 were often regarded with suspicion by volunteers, who felt that men who had to be forced to fight were less reliable than those who had enlisted willingly. This created a two-tier system within units, with volunteers regarding themselves as superior to conscripts regardless of actual performance. The final months of the war, from August through November 1918, saw the Canadian Corps operating at the peak of its capabilities. The set-piece attacks that broke through German defensive lines combined everything learned over 4 years: artillery coordination, infantry tactics, engineering support, air support, logistics. But even in these successful operations, the human cost remained significant. Advancing several miles might seem like a triumph compared to earlier battles where hundreds of yards was considered success, but it still meant Canadian casualties in the thousands. Every German defensive position that had to be cleared, every machine gun nest that had to be suppressed, every artillery battery that had to be silenced, all cost lives. Private Joseph Martin of the 1st Canadian Division was killed during the advance toward Valenciennes in early November, shot by a German rearguard sniper. His death, coming just days before the armistice, seemed particularly tragic to his comrades, but it was no different from thousands of others throughout the war. The liberation of French and Belgian towns and villages during the final advance provided some of the few genuinely positive experiences for Canadian soldiers. Civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation greeted Canadian troops as liberators, offering what food and drink they had, decorating soldiers with flowers, weeping with relief that the occupation was ending. These moments of human connection, of being welcomed as saviours rather than simply being soldiers advancing through contested terrain, provided a glimpse of what the fighting was supposedly about. But the celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that so many comrades had died to reach this point, and that many French and Belgian civilians had suffered terribly under occupation. The armistice on November 11th did not immediately end military operations for the Canadian Corps. Units were required to march into Germany as part of the occupation force and maintain military readiness in case hostilities resumed. This meant that soldiers who had survived 4 years of combat could not simply go home, but had to endure additional months of military service in a foreign country. The occupation duty was generally quiet, but it was frustrating for men who wanted nothing more than to return to Canada and resume civilian life. Tensions between soldiers and officers increased as the military purpose that had justified strict discipline evaporated, and soldiers saw no reason to continue tolerating conditions they had accepted during wartime. The demobilization and return to Canada was a lengthy, often chaotic process. Priority for repatriation was given based on length of service, family circumstances, and the needs of the Canadian economy for labour. This meant that some soldiers who had enlisted late in the war returned home before veterans who had served since 1914, creating resentment. The voyage back across the Atlantic was cramped and uncomfortable, though it seemed luxurious compared to the trenches. When troopships finally docked at Halifax or other Canadian ports, the men disembarking were different from those who had sailed away years before. They had aged beyond their years, seen things that could not be adequately described to those who had not experienced them, and carried wounds both visible and invisible that would mark them for life. Reintegration into civilian society proved difficult for many veterans. Jobs that had been promised might no longer be available or could not be performed by men with physical disabilities. Families had changed during the years of absence, and veterans found themselves strangers in their own homes. The psychological gap between those who had experienced the trenches and those who had remained in Canada was unbridgeable. No amount of explanation could make civilians truly understand what veterans had experienced. Many former soldiers found themselves isolated, unable to talk about the war with civilians who did not understand, seeking out other veterans who could comprehend without needing detailed explanation. Veterans organizations provided some support and comradeship, but they could not undo the fundamental damage the war had inflicted. The physical legacy of the war in Canada took the form of monuments in nearly every town and village, granite or bronze memorials bearing lists of local men who had died. These memorials became focal points for annual Remembrance Day ceremonies on November 11th, where veterans and civilians gathered to honor the dead. The ceremonies were occasions for both genuine remembrance and problematic myth-making, as the complicated realities of war were often simplified into narratives of heroic sacrifice for freedom. Veterans who attended these ceremonies usually remained silent about the more disturbing aspects of their experience, participating in the public commemoration while keeping their private memories to themselves. The larger monuments, particularly the Canadian National Vimy Memorial, unveiled in 1936, became pilgrimage sites for Canadians seeking to connect with the war experience of a previous generation. The Vimy Memorial, with its two soaring limestone pillars overlooking the Douai Plain, bears the names of over 11,000 Canadian soldiers who were killed in France and have no known grave. Walking among those names, reading the ages of the dead, so many 18, 19, 20 years old, brings home the human cost in a way that statistics cannot. The memorial sits atop tunnels and trenches that have been preserved, allowing visitors to see something of the conditions in which men fought and died, though no preserved site can truly convey the reality of being shelled constantly, or the fear of going over the top knowing that many would not return. The long-term impact of the First World War on Canada extended into politics, society, and national identity. The Conservative government that had overseen conscription was crushed in the 1921 election, punished particularly by Quebec voters who never forgave the policy. The war had demonstrated that Canada could field a formidable military force, which influenced Canada's approach to defence and foreign policy for decades. But it had also demonstrated the terrible cost of modern industrial warfare, which made Canada wary of future European entanglements. When the Second World War began in 1939, Canadians enlisted in large numbers, but with fewer illusions than the volunteers of 1914 had possessed. They knew from fathers' and uncles' experiences what war truly meant. The Canadian Corps of 1914 to 1918 represented both the best and worst of what modern warfare could produce. At its best, it was a citizen army that developed into one of the most effective military formations of the war, achieving victories through tactical innovation, thorough preparation, and extraordinary courage. The men who served in it came from all parts of Canadian society and forged bonds through shared hardship that transcended the divisions of civilian life. They learned to function in conditions of unimaginable horror, accomplished missions that others had failed to complete, and earned a reputation that persists a century later. These were genuine achievements, purchased at terrible cost, and they deserve to be remembered. But the cost itself must also be remembered. 66,000 dead, 172,000 wounded, thousands more psychologically damaged, all in a war whose outcome did not justify the sacrifice. The tactical successes at Vimy, Hill 70 and Amiens did not make the war itself less futile, or the deaths of individual soldiers less tragic. The brutality that made the Canadian Corps effective was not something to celebrate, but a consequence of being thrust into a type of warfare that reduced men to their most basic survival instincts. The survivors who returned home were victims as much as heroes, men who had given years of their lives, and often their health, to a cause that benefited politicians and generals more than common soldiers. 100 years after the armistice, the legacy of the Canadian Expeditionary Force remains contested. Official commemorations tend toward the heroic narrative, emphasizing sacrifice, duty, and national achievement. This is not entirely wrong. The courage displayed by soldiers like Private George Price, killed 2 minutes before the end, or Sergeant Michael O'Donnell, who led his men through the gas attack at 2nd Ypres, was genuine and deserves recognition. But a complete understanding requires also acknowledging the waste, the futility, the suffering that served no good purpose, the men who died not heroically, but randomly, killed by artillery shells they never heard coming, or machine gun bullets fired by enemies they never saw. It requires acknowledging that much of what made the Canadian Corps effective was a willingness to accept casualties that should have been unacceptable. The men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were products of their time, motivated by factors both admirable and problematic: patriotism, but also imperialism; courage, but also peer pressure and fear of being seen as cowards; desire to protect their country, but also desire for adventure and escape from mundane lives. They found themselves in a war that none of them truly understood, fighting for objectives that changed constantly in conditions that would have seemed unimaginable before 1914. Some responded with heroism, some with brutality, many with both. They endured experiences that left permanent scars, and most of them carried the war with them for the rest of their lives, in nightmares and memories that could not be shared, in wounds that never fully healed, in absences that could never be filled. The final accounting of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War cannot be reduced to simple narratives of triumph or tragedy. It was both and neither, a complicated story of ordinary men caught up in extraordinary circumstances who sometimes displayed remarkable courage and sometimes committed acts they would later regret, who achieved significant military success at costs that should have been unacceptable, who earned a reputation for ferocity that was both deserved and disturbing. Their service shaped Canada as a nation for better and worse, and their legacy remains written in monuments across the country and battlefields across France and Belgium. They deserve to be remembered not as plaster saints or simple heroes, but as complex human beings who endured things that should not have been asked of anyone, and whose sacrifices purchased a victory that cost more than anyone should have paid.